It is Thursday, December 13th, 2018. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Joining me today on this special election 2018 episode is Johnny Kauffman. Johnny is currently a reporter with Public Broadcasting Atlanta here at WABE 90.1. Prior to joining WABE, he worked as a producer with Georgia Public Broadcasting and National Public Radio, where he helped produce Morning Edition, Weekend Edition, and Tell Me More. A fellow Midwesterner, Johnny grew up in Indiana. He's a graduate of Earlham College. But today we're talking Georgia politics. And on behalf of everyone at the Russell Library, thank you very much, Johnny, for taking some time out this morning and this afternoon to speak with us. I wonder, since this is your first time on the program, tell us a little bit about your childhood, your upbringing in Indiana, and sort of how you got down here to the bustling metropolis in Atlanta.
Okay, so I grew up in Goshen, Indiana, which is a small town of about 35,000 in northern Indiana, about 30 minutes from the Michigan border. Went to Earlham College, like you said, and soon after I graduated from Earlham, I got an internship at NPR in D.C. I was there for about a year doing production for some of the shows there, and then got a job at Georgia Public Broadcasting down here, a full-time job, and took that. Eventually switched over to WABE, and at some point I was still producing here, and both of our political reporters quit. And so I was like, yeah, sure, I can do that. So I started covering... I've only been a reporter covering politics, really. I have done some general assignment stuff, but mostly covering politics, and really started covering politics, I would say, in the midst of the 2016 presidential primaries was kind of when I jumped into it.
So how familiar were you with Southern politics or Georgia politics before you took your job at GPB or here at WABE?
I mean, not really much at all. I think I knew the civil rights history in the South and the history of enslavement and the Civil War. And so I had that sort of perspective on politics. But in terms of like Reconstruction, I didn't know much about that. I definitely didn't. I think I knew that Georgia was a Republican-controlled state, but I didn't really understand what that meant. And I didn't know the sort of dynamic of the switch from the recent-ish switch from Democrat to Republican in the state.
So how did you prepare, or how do political reporters, I guess, prepare themselves for covering Georgia politics? Is this something where somebody hands you one of those Georgia Politics for Dummy books and say, read it cover to cover and go talk to folks? How does that work?
I had been working on this show called Closer Look at WABE, and at the time the hosts were Rose Scott, who still hosts the show, and Dennis O'Hare, who's now retired, but was later our morning edition host, our morning host. And Dennis had covered Georgia politics for a long time,
right?
Decades. And so I watched him as when I was a producer for that show, and I think that kind of gave me a sense of what it would take to do it. And then having Dennis, the reputation that Dennis had, and he had a lot of respect amongst the leading lawmakers.
Oh, sure.
And so people knew that I was associated with Dennis, and so that made it a little bit easier at the beginning. Yeah.
So tell me about that first experience covering Georgia politics. What sort of stories did you work on? What was that experience like?
The first big event that I remember covering is I was still a producer at this time, but the Eric Erickson's Red State Gathering was here. I don't know if that was at the end of 2015 or the beginning of 2016.
I think it may have been beginning because it was right as the Republican primary was tuning up, I believe.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was crazy. All the Republican presidential candidates basically were here, except Trump was disinvited from the event because he had just made disparaging comments about Megyn Kelly on Fox and Friends or on cable news somewhere. And so Erickson had disinvited him. And is especially interesting looking back, I think maybe other reporters who were more experienced than I was at the time realized this, is that really, even though Trump wasn't there, he still dominated the event because everybody was being asked about Trump.
Sure.
And so, the candidates would get on stage and they would do their stump speech and stuff, but then in the press conferences, everyone is asking them about Trump, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think I filed some stories from that. I remember I spoke to Secretary Kemp about the SEC primary at the time because that was kind of the reason for doing the story. These candidates are in the South, and Georgia is seen as a little bit more key in the Republican primary than it had been in the past. And Trump was kind of dominating the story. And I mean, that was kind of, that in a sense has kind of been the continuing thread throughout my time covering politics here. So it was kind of trial by fire there at the beginning with such sort of a intense, crazy event.
Right. And a trial that just sort of, I don't know if it stopped.
Right.
At least not for political reporters anyway.
Yeah.
So, WABE is here in Atlanta. Atlanta's public broadcasting. Did you go out because Marco Rubio actually won Metro Atlanta in the Republican primary, but Donald Trump and Ted Cruz really dominated outside of the Metro Atlanta bubble. Was that something that you were covering, the Georgia politics beyond Atlanta? I
don't think I had much time to get outside of Metro Atlanta during that primary that I remember. I did, though. There was one weekend where I think Rubio had an event in Cobb County that I went to, and I remember going to a Ben Carson event at a church outside of Metro Atlanta too. I think that was in Hall County, so that was a little bit out there.
Okay.
But yeah, that was about the extent that I got outside of Atlanta.
So did you cover election night 2016?
Yes.
What was that like?
In the primary or the
general election?
Sorry. That was not my first election night.
Okay.
It was late, I remember, because Clinton didn't concede until the next day.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, I don't remember being super surprised by the result. I was at the Republican watch party, and everyone was really excited there. It had been pretty clear that Senator Isaacson had been reelected early on, so that was one story that we were working on. This kind of titan of Georgia politics had gotten his seat back again. And then when Trump went, I think the sort of first thing that I was thinking about that night was like, what is this going to mean for my next week in terms of covering this, but also the next 4 years if I'm still going to be a politics reporter.
Right.
It was kind of trying to figure out what was going to come next, and that was pretty hard. I don't think any of us really knew what it was going to be like covering politics after that.
Yeah, I guess that's a good segue. How has the election of Donald Trump, how has that changed the dynamic of being a political reporter here in Georgia from before 2016 to election night 2016, inauguration on forward to where we're at now?
To me, I don't think it's changed that much, actually. Others may have a different perspective on this because they've been around longer than I have.
Sure.
But Georgia politics still functions somewhat independently of what's happening nationally. And I think particularly Republican voters in Georgia like their independence, and they don't like to be told what they're supposed to do based on what is happening nationally. I found that particularly during the 6th District special election.
That was going to be my next question. Speaking of nationalizing local elections.
That was certainly a nationalized race, clearly. But I think Republicans in the 6th District, they feel very passionately that this is their Republican area, and they were not going to be told what to do by anybody from the outside. And so I found that a lot talking to people outside the polls during early voting, is that they were like, look, Karen Handel may not be my favorite pick, but like we don't want anybody else telling us what we're going to do in this district, and this is a Republican district, and we're going to keep it that way.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe having Trump as the president has kind of ramped that up, the sort of this is our team, and that sort of partisanship in Georgia. But in the broad scheme of things, I don't see Trump's election having changed how we cover politics here that much.
So, right around that same time, in 2017, there was also a mayoral election in the city of Atlanta. Did you cover?
Not much, no.
Okay.
Yeah. I was trying to kind of take a little bit of break from covering campaigns, so I was trying to step back from that a little bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, you would have to save your energy for a primary and runoff and the general election of 2018. Yeah. So now we're here, a little over a month post general election. Think back to the primary, the Republican primary for governor. You had Casey Cagle and others. Mm-hmm. The conventional wisdom being Casey Cagle was going to take the nomination pretty easily. Mm-hmm. Tell me about covering that Republican primary and your sense of, as you were covering it, when you began to notice the shifting ground within the Republican gubernatorial race.
Yeah. Well, this is probably what it was the Kemp ads. Mm-hmm. The Kemp ads with his truck and the Jake ad where he points the shotgun in the direction of the teenager. I had felt that Kemp had a chance to sort of set himself apart from the other candidates. I'd covered him quite a bit before as Secretary of State, and he just had an ability to excite and mobilize conservatives in a way that I don't think the other candidates did. And so then when those ads came out, it was kind of an indication to us that, and the response they got, even the backlash from the left, that Kemp was going to have a good chance of being against Cagle in the runoff.
Oh, do you think that, since you mentioned the backlash, do you think the backlash from, as you said, the left? I think Huffington Post picked up the story, made it on MSNBC.
Sure.
More left-leaning outlets. Do you think the backlash actually benefited Brian Kemp?
Definitely. Yeah, Kemp. His tone has changed now that he's been elected governor, but he, for a long time as Secretary of State, really tried to make the left, liberal activists, especially even civil rights activists, as a foil for him. He always defined himself as a fighter who was fighting against these forces who were trying to tell Georgia what to do, trying to turn the state too liberal, fighting against Georgia values, as he put them. And many times they were, when he was Secretary of State, it was these groups that sued him over obstacles that his office or the state legislature had put in the way of voting, and he reacted as this being like a liberal, attack. Mm-hmm. And that was always how he defined himself and did quite well as that fighter. I think Georgia voters, conservatives, responded really well to it. And so when that backlash started coming to those ads, I think that's exactly what Kemp wanted, because it allowed him to continue to portray himself as a fighter who was standing up for Georgia values and pushing back against these outside liberals, basically. That's the way he frames it.
Sure. When you talk about the confrontations, are you talking about the New Georgia Project that Stacey Abrams founded and ran? Or are you also talking about in 2016, where I think it was either Homeland Security or it was some the Obama administration reaching out to secretaries of state, elections division?
Yeah, sure. It was all of that. I mean, Stacey Abrams, the New Georgia Project, her group that was trying to register and engage more people of color in the state, who sued Kemp's office. But also this, like the NAACP and other voting rights groups that have been around the state for a long time that were often involved in lawsuits against his office. And then, yes, Obama and the Obama administration, any chance that he had to stand up to the Obama administration, he would definitely do that.
So Brian Kemp makes it into the runoff. edging past Hunter Hill, I believe, who came in third. A couple turning points in that runoff, 9-week runoff. First, the Clay Tippins audio tape. Did you cover that and the uproar over the leaked audio?
Yeah, that was wild. That was wild. I mean, that whole, particularly the runoff, the runoff campaign was one of the craziest races that I've covered since I've been reporting on politics in Georgia. Yeah, when the tape came out, it was hard to think of a worse thing that could have happened to Casey Cagle, because it played on the negative. It played up the negative sort of ways that the Kemp campaign and others were trying to portray Cagle as a politician who was so caught up in politics and the lobbyist community at the Capitol that was really what he was familiar with most, not with people's interests or with policy or that kind of thing.
And of course the big news was Donald Trump's endorsement.
Right.
Did you have any inkling that endorsement was, sometimes campaigns leak these things, that, be on the lookout? Did you get any heads up?
No, they didn't give me a heads up on that. But I don't usually get heads up on that kind of stuff. But it didn't. I didn't know that it was coming. It didn't surprise me when it came, because we had already been sensing that, especially after the tape, that Cagle was in trouble. And so, Trump likes to pick who he thinks is going to win. But yeah, when that endorsement came, it was definitely a huge deal, and I think certainly pushed Kemp across the finish line for sure.
Right. Do you think it was decisive, or was that just sort of the coup de grace that Kemp may have won anyway, but...
Yeah, this is something that I think has been a matter of debate, but I don't really think it is. I think Kemp was going to win even if Trump hadn't endorsed either candidate. He had the momentum, clearly. He had those ads. There was the Cagle tape. His base, Kemp's base, was already going to be the base that was more likely to turn out in a primary runoff. And so I don't think that the Trump endorsement was the deciding factor in the race. It certainly increased Kemp's margin and made it super decisive, but I think he would have won anyways.
Were you surprised by the magnitude of Kemp's?
Yeah, it was surprising. That, and then, I mean, I don't know if we're going to talk about the Democratic primary.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I was also surprised by the margin in the Democratic primary.
Right. Well, that's a good...
Sorry.
No. We're freewheeling here. But no, that's 157 counties on the Republican side in the runoff. We can take a step back to the primary, the Stacey Abrams versus Stacey Evans race. How did you cover that campaign? As opposed to the Republican campaign, which was totally different dynamic. How did you cover the Democratic side?
In terms of the day-to-day, I didn't spend as much time covering that campaign, honestly, because I always, and we talked about this in the office, we felt that, and this is not necessarily, we have limited resources. And so we try to do the best service to our audience
like
as
any
we
newsroom
can.
these days. Yeah.
And so we certainly covered the Abrams-Evans race quite a bit, but it felt that Abrams was always in a much stronger position to win that race. And so we definitely spent a little bit more time covering the Republican race.
Well, what were the metrics that you used to gauge your assessment of the Democratic side?
I think the polling that was out there, and I think the money that was raised by the candidates certainly gave us the indication that Abrams was going to win. But we did a lot of coverage of that race. I don't want to make it sound like we just ignored it.
Right.
The other thing is that there was a national interest in that race beyond what was the national interest in the Republican primary, at least at that point. And so we sort of leaned on our national partners at NPR, who there was a reporter who came down here and did some stories about the Abrams-Evans race. And so I figured that my resources would be better spent covering the Republican contest, which was getting less national attention.
But you said you were still surprised by the margin in the Democratic primary. Why is that?
I did think it was going to be closer than it was. I thought Abrams was going to win by maybe like 10 points or 15 points, and I don't remember what the exact margin was, but it was much larger than that,
I think it was pretty close to 75-25, 70-30, somewhere in that neighborhood.
And I think that's a credit to the Evans campaign, actually, in a way, making the race seem like it was closer than it was in the end. I mean, they did a good job of communicating their message and defining themselves differently than Abrams in a way that seemed that they had a real shot and that they were also doing something unique in the state, even if it had been done by Democratic candidates in the past. I think what the Evans campaign did in terms of trying to reach out to more moderate Democrats and not saying we're just going to have a progressive message, we're going to try to reach to people who may have been more Republican-leaning in the past, that's really a unique message at this time in the country, particularly in the South. Even if it is historically not been unique in Georgia, it was unique at the time. And so I think that by taking that approach, it was kind of like we were seeing almost, there was so much uncertainty about what the Democratic Party was that we were seeing these two experiments playing out at the same time. Abrams, there was talked about more as an experiment because what she was doing had not historically been done before, right? But the Evans campaign was also trying something that I think was pretty unique given the current political environment.
Right.
And in a way, I think the Evans campaign might disagree with me on this, but I think the result of the race indicated, at least in Georgia, which is which is going to win the primary, at least, which is more popular amongst the Democratic base right now.
Well, I guess that already answers the question. Is what is the future of the sort of Stacey Evans, Roy Barnes, Buddy Darden sort of centrist, moderate Democratic approach? Does it have a future in Democratic politics, at least in the primary?
I think that will continue to be tried. I don't think that the more moderate approach, the Democrats have given up on that. I think it is maybe, I think race has a lot to do with it. I mean, I think like everything in Georgia politics, but I think if you have a white candidate running on the same sort of progressive platform that Abrams did, they're just because there is still a lot of racism in our state, that they're going to be seen as the more moderate candidate.
I see. It's sort of perceived or at least projected on the candidate.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think, that kind of complicates things. Will a candidate again run as a more moderate Democrat in the primary? That seems unlikely to me.
Right.
At this point, particularly because we saw how close the race was for governor and how divided the state is, that in that sense, the argument that, well, we need to run a more moderate candidate so they can win in a general election, it's harder to make that case now than it was before 2018.
Well, what about on the Republican side? You've got Casey Cagle, who had been lieutenant governor for 3 terms, running sort of the establishment capital. I don't want to call it professional, but that's not the right word.
Yeah. But
definitely the candidate of the governing party, experience, establishment may be a 4-letter word. I don't know, but I find it hard to find a better term for it. Is that a strategy that just isn't going to work again in primaries with the Republican electorate as composed now?
These are tough questions.
Yeah.
I think
we try.
For me, it's hard to, like I talked about how Kemp had, established himself as a fighter.
Right.
And I think that based on the media environment right now, based on what President Trump has sort of overturned the norms of what a political candidate will be. I think a candidate who is still the leader in sort of the governing party, I think they could still win. I think they have to be a charismatic candidate who's going to get out there and yell and scream a little bit.
A style tone as opposed to maybe policy, which is more muted in this environment. Okay.
Yeah. So I think that was more. That's not who Casey Cagle is. He tried to portray himself as that, particularly as the runoff got towards the end. He tried to portray himself more as a fighter and someone who was going to, really get out there and go after it for his constituents. And he may do that behind the scenes and in this sort of like negotiating and deal-making way, but not in a way that like sells well on TV or on the radio. I remember talking to him at a campaign event close to the end of the runoff, and I was asking him about the tape, and he said, I don't want to talk about the tape anymore. And I said, well, do you still think, you said on that tape that this primary is about who's the craziest candidate. And he said, well, and this was something you would have never heard Cagle say before, but he said, well, I'm crazy. He said, I'm crazy about my wife, I'm crazy about my kids, I'm crazy about a lot of things. And to me, that was like, well, that just kind of sums up the whole runoff that we're in right now. But also, like, that's just not who Cagle was, at least in my experience in dealing with him before. And it felt like he was seeing that stylistically and tone-wise, his message had not latched on in the way that he had hoped it would. And so I think that was part of his problem.
Well, we get to the general election, and for Democrats, it's always been the argument that, at least among a group of Democrats or observers, that demographics eventually is going to favor the Democratic Party. And so, sort of a wait and see. Were Democrats, or at least Stacey Abrams' campaign, the Democratic Party of Georgia, were they more proactive this year in trying to capitalize on demographic change than they have been in the past?
I think so. Abrams was clear that she was going to give a message to the people of color in Georgia who hadn't had a candidate on the Democratic side who reached out to them in that way before, and was sort of unabashed about that. And for years, really, she founded the New Georgia Project, which was meant to register and get people to the polls, people of color and young people to the polls who would be likely Democratic voters. She stepped away from that during the campaign, but in some ways, I mean, for years she had been setting up her run to mobilize and turn out people of color in a way that Democratic candidates hadn't done before, and her message certainly linked up with that. I remember her in some tape I heard of her when she was at on Edgewood Avenue in downtown Atlanta. It was late at night on like a weekend around bars and restaurants and stuff. And she told the crowd, there are more of us in this state than there are of them. And it's just a matter of us trusting ourselves that we actually have the numbers to go out and vote and change things in the state. And that was really, I think, summed up what her campaign was trying to do.
So when the votes were coming in, the city of Atlanta and metropolitan Atlanta, extremely blue. Even Gwinnett County, which had not voted Democratic in a gubernatorial election for some time, Stacey Abrams won Gwinnett by 57% of the vote, 54% in Cobb County, which had long been the Republican stronghold. What's driving suburban voters to the Democratic Party, which has not historically been the case?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. I think suburban Atlanta isn't as white as it used to be. More people of color are moving there, or families of people of color there are growing. And so the sort of like suburb-urban divide is just more messy than it was right now. Atlanta itself, I think, is becoming actually more white, the city of Atlanta. It's still really around 50-50 white and people of color in a way that it wasn't before. So there's that going on, and people of color just are more connected to the Democratic Party, right?
Sure.
Also, I do think Trump is pushing some white suburban folks away from the Republican Party, particularly women. And so that has something to do with how the suburbs are turning. I think also, particularly in Metro Atlanta, I don't know how this is around other cities. I assume it's somewhat similar. I think younger people are also moving to the suburbs more than they were in the past, or people who are now starting their families there.
Young professionals.
Yeah, young professionals who are going to have kids or whatever tend to be more attached to the Democratic Party, even if their parents were maybe Republicans when they first moved to the suburbs. So it's a combination of all of those factors, I think, going on. Also, I think Abrams' campaign deserves credit for reaching out to voters in the suburbs and people of color more than campaigns have in the past, and that has something to do with it too.
Well, if you look at the margin of victory for Brian Kemp, about 55,000 votes, those margins came from overwhelming victory in the countryside, but also overwhelming victory in places like Forsyth County, Cherokee County, Bartow County, Oconee County outside Athens. Why haven't, first, those exurban counties, why haven't those sort of followed the same trend towards Democratic Party as sort of those inner suburban counties, Gwinnett, Cobb, DeKalb, Henry, even down on the south side? Why are those counties sort of lagging behind in the sort of leftward trend?
Well, I think, I don't know what the data says about this, but
Right.
I think that as more people of color have moved to the suburbs, as the suburbs have gotten more populated, a lot of the white voters who moved out of the city of Atlanta, for example, during white flight, are now moving to the exurbs. And so in a way, those exurbs are now the new, the new Republican center kind of in the state, or new Republican base in the state, right? Like Newt Gingrich, who kind of made his way in the white Republican suburbs, now that Newt Gingrich would come more out of the exurbs, I think, than closer in.
Why do you think Brian Kemp was able to actually surpass President Trump's numbers in small rural counties, be it in North Georgia or South Georgia?
That, again, combination of things, I could say that to all these, but that's one of the bigger things that strikes me about the election, actually. I think there is just a level of political engagement in this time that surpasses what happened in 2016. And I think Kemp reached out to those counties and focused on those counties in a way maybe that, Trump didn't, because maybe he didn't need to, right? Like Georgia was not really considered a competitive race in 2016, and so there wasn't a need for Trump's campaign, to drive up turnout here necessarily. Right. I mean, I'm sure they were doing the normal kind of things that they would have been doing, but Kemp knew that he had to crank up turnout in those areas, especially seeing what the Abrams campaign was doing. I personally, having spent some time reporting in those areas of Georgia, I think the fact that you had a black woman running for governor may have boosted turnout as well. People who have racist ideas in those parts of the state were motivated by that. And I also think Kemp's campaign did not necessarily shy away from that. I heard from many people of color, and there was some debate amongst these people as well, but I remember I spoke to one couple who brought up the Kemp and the Republicans' sort of label of Abrams as being too extreme for Georgia. And I was in Griffin, Georgia, talking to this couple, and the wife said, when they say too extreme, really what they mean is that she's too black. And this was a black woman, and her black husband disagreed with her on that. But I do think that that kind of labeling and some of the way that the Kemp campaign tried to link Abrams to, for example, the Black Panther Party,
Did you see this on social media, or
Yeah,
was
a lot
it a
on
word of
social
mouth?
media.
Where
Social
were you
media.
seeing it?
Social media a
Okay.
lot that they were doing that, and in their TV ads, and people who I spoke to at Kemp events and on the, out in those areas would not say that they didn't vote for Abrams because she was black, or that they didn't want to support Abrams because she was black, or that they voted for Kemp because Abrams was black, whatever. But they would quickly repeat those lines. She's too extreme for Georgia. She has these links to these groups, those kind of things. And I think that may have motivated some people to vote that weren't necessarily motivated in the past.
Do you think these voting trends in rural areas, suburban areas, are likely to continue in future elections? Or are we going to see some sort of a regression to what had been sort of the norm, at least in the relatively recent past?
Yeah. I think they're likely to continue for the most part. The trend line doesn't go straight.
Sure.
It may dip or whatever. I think it depends a lot. I'm thinking specifically about 2020. I think it depends a lot on who the presidential candidate is in 2020, and the Democratic side, and who's running for Senate, and whether the country can and the state can kind of sustain this interest in politics that we saw in 2018. Turnout was high on both sides, so is that something that will continue, or are people going to start getting worn out by all of it? Those are some of the big questions that I have about what's going to happen next.
How much time and energy did you spend covering the Suburban Atlanta congressional races, either in the 6th or the 7th, where the highly competitive, and obviously results sort of bore that out, that they were competitive. How much time did you spend covering the 6th and 7th races?
Me personally, not very much.
Okay.
But I know from our coverage, we did spend some time looking at those races. I think we really focused on the governor's race because we felt like the 6th and the 7th were. I don't think we thought the 6th and the 7th were going to be as close as they were, or that they were going to flip. I think we thought that Abrams may have a chance statewide.
Right.
And we thought that the candidates in the 6th and the 7th had a chance, but based on the numbers and watching where the money was going, there wasn't a lot of interest from the national parties as much as I thought there might be in the 6th and the 7th.
It did seem to break very late, the idea that they were competitive. I mean, within the last 3 weeks of the campaign, at least based on my watching of things like that. They shifted to toss-up very late compared to, the 40 to 50 other toss-ups around the country.
Exactly. So that was kind of our indication as to why we thought they maybe would be not as close.
Well, I guess, assuming a level of ticket splitting that didn't happen, which was able to carry Lucy McBath and almost Carolyn Bourdeaux to victory, are you surprised that if you look at the ballot from top to bottom, the high end of Republican voting, Gary Black, about 53% of the vote, down to Brad Raffensperger, Chuck Eaton, 49 and change, there's not. We would say the electorate is very inelastic. Why do you think that is, that there is just not ticket splitting the way that there was in the past?
Where to start? I mean,
we could probably do an entire conversation on that.
Yeah, I mean, the partisanship has increased for a number of reasons. You could say gerrymandering has something to do with that. You could say that sort of the atmosphere in Washington, which there's a number of reasons that there's that atmosphere in Washington, has something to do with that. You could say President Trump has really tried to make this an us versus them scenario. Again, that sort of like fighting mentality that he feels benefits him. And so that has affected the polarization. Certainly the media landscape may have something to do with that as well. Like Fox News versus MSNBC.
Sure.
Not that they're on the same level, but So I think all of that accounts for it. I think there is also, there's a combination of like a lack of interest in state level politics and local politics. And also I think candidates and campaigns don't necessarily feel like it's a priority for them to reach local voters.
Gotcha.
In the same way, because they know that things are going to hinge on party in the end anyways. So all of that has to do with that. I would say though, like I think there is still some flexibility in the electorate. I mean, like Gary Black is a great example of this. I know a number of Democrats who voted for Gary Black because they like the guy and they feel like he does a good job and he really cares about Georgia. So there is I would tell this, I guess, to politicians, you can still win by not being as partisan and by just trying to do a really good job. And you can still win votes that way. I think Gary Black is an example of that. He may have a little bit of an advantage because he's like the guy who like goes in after the hurricane and is there to like comfort people and like work with like farmers and that kind of thing. Because of his position as the agriculture commissioner. But I do think he's a good example of a politician who just everyone respects and that wins him votes.
Right. What's the top line takeaway from the runoff, the Secretary of State's runoff, John Barrow versus Brad Raffensperger, and also Lindy Miller, Chuck Eaton in the Public Service Commission race?
Republicans show up for runoffs. That's the trend. I think older voters and white voters tend to show up for runoffs. You could say that as well. And I think what the Democrats, there's a couple things the Democrats could take away from the runoffs. What Abrams did and the voters she motivated and mobilized in the general election, they need to be mobilized and motivated again. And you could point to that just being an infrastructure thing. You know, there maybe weren't as many people knocking doors or making phone calls for the runoff as there were in the general. You could also say that's a motivating thing for the Democrats. Was John Barrow this like moderate white candidate for Secretary of State? He's drastically different than Stacey Abrams. And so I think some Democrats would say, well, you know, if Barrow had come out as more progressive and tried to sell himself more to people of color, which I think he did, but should we be putting up more candidates of color for offices and not, again, trying this sort of like more moderate approach, white candidates who can maybe win black and white voters?
You mentioned sort of the warnings for Democrats. Are there warning signs for the Republican Party as well, even though they won both those seats?
Yeah, I mean, I think this election is full of warning signs for Republicans, particularly in the suburbs, but their margin is very slim right now in the state, it appears. And they could lose statewide. They could lose the House and the Senate in the next number of years.
Right.
Those are no longer outside the realm of possibility.
I think we were talking about whether the votes are going to be there for Republicans if they follow sort of the same rural-centric, base-centric turnout operation that was successful in 2018.
Yeah. So I'll go back to my answer.
Sure.
So besides winning this election in 2018 in Georgia, which is a big deal, the Republicans really don't have much, I think, that they can be happy about from the election. I think they should be worried. Yes, Kemp ramped up turnout in rural white areas. That's a big deal, and that shows something that the Republicans can do going forward. But in a presidential year, when turnout is typically higher, it's hard to see where the Republicans are now going to get more votes to match what would we expect to be higher turnout on the Democratic side.
Right.
So when I was in, this is unusual, but I was at the State House a few days after the election, I think, or maybe the next week, and there was a Republican caucus meeting in the House. And there was a lot of questioning and sort of mourning almost for their Republican colleagues who weren't going to be there for the next term. And also a lot of questions being asked about what do we need to do different, and also a lot of commitment from the leadership that we need to recommit ourselves to being to getting out there and getting our votes out.
Right.
And I think this has been a question facing the Republicans for a while, particularly in the legislature. Like, are we being too conservative in the policy that we're putting forth, and in the discussion that is getting the most attention in the State House? Religious liberty legislation, for example, campus carry takes up a lot of energy in discussion, and I think that debate is going to be more at the forefront now than it was in the past. But I don't think there's really a clear answer at all for the Republicans about how they're going to answer that.
I mean, that's a good way to lead us into the question that, like you talked about, you're listening into this caucus meeting, and 13 metropolitan Republicans in the State House have lost their seats. 2 Republican state senators in Metro lost their seats or are losing their seat. I believe one was David Schaefer's open seat. So the Republican caucus is going to be more rural, more conservative, yet the conversations you're hearing are saying we need to do more to bolster credentials and standing with metropolitan voters, right, maybe in Atlanta, in other metropolitan areas across the state. How do those two things work out together? What comes of that?
This is kind of the question that, at least since I've been covering Georgia politics, has been a big question. To me, it turns to the business community and the Chamber of Commerce. How much influence are they going to have in the State House over these more conservative Republicans? Will the conservative Republicans, the rural Republicans, fall in line and stay away from the legislation that concerns the business community because it may give Georgia a bad reputation to the rest of the country, for example? Whether that's fair or not, that's kind of the perceived reputation that it puts off. And that I don't know how long that kind of will hold. Because I do think the business community still runs the state and still runs the legislature in a lot of ways. For example, we are seeing Governor-elect Kemp now come more to the middle and saying we need to put politics behind us after this race, when he had some of the most inflammatory ads that we've ever seen in Georgia politics. He walked across the street and met with Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, the mayor of Atlanta.
So I think we were talking about the legislature and sort of what to expect coming out of a diminished metropolitan Republican caucus.
Yeah.
But also with Brian Kemp, a governor who had made a lot of who has shown, like as you said, that at least moderate, reaching out, to the other side, but also made a lot of promises to rural Georgia. So what do you think the governing priorities of the governor-elect are going to be coming into that new legislature just over a month, or just under a month away, I suppose?
He did make a lot of promises. He promised teacher raises. That will be one of his, I think, top items. At least they're going to try to do that. Rural healthcare and boosting rural hospitals will be a big one. Rural broadband. And, a lot of these fall in line with what the Republican-controlled legislature has been trying to do, particularly last year.
Right.
So in that way, I think he should have not too much trouble with some of that stuff. The budget is going to be tricky for him. I don't envy the position they're in, having made a lot of promises on the budget, also promising to cut things and to limit things, promising to cut taxes, and promising these teacher raises. And the budget is just really complicated.
Right.
And Governor Deal's budget team was really strong. And so that means that Kemp is going to be coming in with a team that's not as experienced in that area and making a lot of moves in the budget that will be very complicated. So I think that is probably going to be one of the trickier things.
Does the makeup of his transition team give any hints as to how he'll govern as the chief executive, or does it give hints on those priorities, those policy priorities at all?
I think it largely mirrors what his campaign staff was and what his staff was in the Secretary of State's office. So I think we can expect it to be more of that, along with trying to sort of continue what Governor Deal has done. Governor Deal is super popular, so if Kemp can kind of just continue along that path, they'll probably be in good shape. You know, Governor Deal had like criminal justice reform and education were some of the issues that we talk about him and he will be remembered for, along with the state's sort of fiscal health and job growth and how he went through the recession and came out of it. Kemp, I think we don't know what is going to be that issue for him.
Right.
You know, I guess education kind of mirrors this in that it's a really challenging thing. If we talk about like improving the rural economy and improving rural areas and rural healthcare, again, super challenging. I mean, in a ways that's kind of like a losing fight. Some people from Metro Atlanta would look at it that way. So that's that. If he picks that, it's going to be really hard. So I don't know what Kemp will kind of want to be known for, or what he'll make as his number one issues. I think right now it's him trying to follow through on campaign promises, and that's going to be enough to keep them pretty busy.
What about on the other side? What do you think happens to Stacey Abrams, her operation, her network of supporters in the state, and her not inconsequential network of supporters nationally?
I think they remain very loyal to her, and she will continue, I assume, to fundraise and to try to advocate for some of the issues that she's worked on, voting in particular. That will remain a big thing. I think people are hanging on her words to see what she's going to do next. We've seen her in some interviews and public appearances say that she's planning on running again. We just don't know what she's going to run for yet.
Right.
So people will wait and see. I wouldn't expect that she'll reveal that too soon.
Right.
But yeah, I don't. I mean, Abrams was a super charismatic candidate who is very popular, not only in Georgia but nationally. So it wouldn't surprise me if all those people stick around and wait, and she'll try to motivate her supporters again down the road.
Voting, as you alluded to, voting. Real perceived voter suppression was really, I think when folks look back, that's probably going to be the issue that sticks out, at least in folks' memory, is the arguments back and forth about voting access. Did you cover that during the campaign as well? And what was it that you were covering, and what did you find actually talking to folks who, voters, people involved in the Secretary of State's office, and then in local boards of election? What was going on in terms of voting access and voting suppression in 2018?
It all came to a head in 2018. Georgia's Republican-controlled legislature for years has put up new obstacles to voting. Voter ID, programs to verify people's identity. At the same time, you had the Supreme Court decision that threw out part of the Voting Rights Act
Shelby
pre-clearance.
case.
So that decisions could be made at the local level that did not, in Georgia, that did not need to be pre-cleared by the Department of Justice at the federal level. And you also had Secretary of State Kemp, who refused to resign as the state's top election official while he was running for governor. And so in that way, it really was not surprising that all of this came up to me. As far as what actually happened on the ground, what local election officials are saying and that kind of thing, these issues are so widespread, and there's 159 counties in Georgia. And so it's hard to know. We continue to be trying to figure out exactly what happened on Election Day. Mm-hmm. And that's not unique to 2018. I think after 2016, it would still take a long time to figure out what exactly went down on Election Day. Turnout was really high. If we're just talking about Election Day, turnout was really high. Mm-hmm. There were long lines in a lot of places. There were some machines that didn't work, or there weren't enough machines distributed.
Or extension cords, apparently.
Exactly.
That was also an issue.
And so there's always chaos on Election Day, but I think there was more chaos on Election Day in 2018 than there had been in the past.
How does this experience in 2018 inform what's probably going to be one of the bigger issues before the General Assembly, which is updating Georgia's voting infrastructure? I think this was the 16th year with the Diebold electronic voting machines, which cutting edge in 2002, 2004, not so much in 2018. What do you think the General Assembly is going to do about voting and the voting infrastructure in Georgia?
I'm still trying to figure that out, but I think 2018 complicates the process of picking the new machines, mm-hmm. but I don't know if it will actually inform that process very much.
How do you mean?
Because we already knew before what happened before the chaos on Election Day in 2018 and before these lawsuits and all of that there were issues with Georgia's voting machines, just in the fact that cybersecurity experts warn that because there's no paper trail that they're more susceptible to hacking and they can't be audited, and that's a problem. So we knew that before 2018. But after 2018 and the conversation around the election and the debate around the election and the way that the Abrams campaign has continued to bring attention to this issue, what I'm still uncertain about is how during the legislative session that will affect the conversation and who wields power over what the new machines look like.
Gotcha.
Republicans have said in the past that they want the new machines to be picked on a bipartisan basis. And former Secretary of State Kathy Cox has said the same thing, that she has warned folks looking at this issue that if they're not picked on a bipartisan basis, it will undermine further trust in the elections.
Right.
So how far do Democrats leverage what happened in 2018 to affect the conversation around what the new machines are picked? And at what point do they pull back and say, okay, we just need to pick these new machines that have a paper trail and move on?
Right.
In many ways, the selection of the new machines is, I think, separate from some of the accusations about voter access and those kind of things that came up. The issues are complicated in terms of long lines in the administration mm-hmm. of the election. But like I said before, we knew that there needed to be new machines, and there's basically consensus that there needed to be new machines before the 2018 election. Mm-hmm. So that, in a sense, doesn't change too much about it.
Looking ahead to 2020, and you sort of already mentioned it in relation to Stacey Abrams, but are you already hearing or seeing the rumblings of the Democratic candidate for Senate to face David Perdue? Are party insiders already thinking about and jockeying for position in what's going to be a high-profile race 2 years from now?
Definitely, they are. We've heard about Teresa Tomlinson, the mayor of Columbus, who's thinking about running. Abrams would be a potential candidate as well. I think there are others. John Ossoff, for example, who ran in the 6th District in that special election. I think people have been thinking about that race against Perdue for a while. That is going to be a super interesting race. And I don't think the Democrats know in Georgia who they want to be their mm-hmm. candidate yet, or who they'd even want to put in a primary. I think it has a lot to do with who runs for president as well, because Purdue is going to be so linked to Trump, and he's set himself up to be that way.
Sure.
So whoever is running in Georgia will need to fit in with, I think, the presidential candidate, because I think Georgia is going to be a competitive state and a contested state in 2020. And so you may see whoever's running for president on the same podium quite a bit with whoever the Democratic candidate is for Senate.
So do you think, looking ahead, what is the greatest danger to continued Republican dominance in Georgia? Since about 2002, and then especially 2012-14, where we hit perhaps the high water mark of Republican strength, what's the biggest danger facing Georgia Republicans, do you think?
Probably President Trump and the way that he motivates in opposition people of color and white progressives in Atlanta and in the suburbs.
Mm-hmm.
And who knows what's going to happen in Washington with the investigations or with, national security and these kind of issues, and the uncertainty that may throw into a 2020 race and how that may motivate Democrats as well. I think that, and also how President Trump may turn away some more moderate Republicans and potentially push them to the Democratic side.
Right.
I see that as the biggest threat to Republicans here in the state.
What do you think? What do you think the state of the two-party system is here in Georgia? Because, like I said, for at least the last couple decades, almost 2 decades, it's been a relatively robust, safe Republican territory outside of urban centers and down sort of in the black belt of southwest Georgia. What's the state of the two-party system in Georgia between the two parties?
We are moving towards being a purple state and continue to be very polarized and are potentially growing more polarized. So I think the two-party system is strong in terms of there are two parties that are very walled off and have very strong bases. And I don't see there being more room for another third party to spring up in Georgia anytime soon.
Were you surprised at how anemic the libertarian turnout? Well, I mean, again, we're talking degrees here. 3-4% is what had been anticipated. Ted Metz didn't even break 1% in the governor's race. Was that surprising to you, that how little influence the libertarians had at all?
No. The thing that struck me from the beginning of the polling during the general election was how few undecided voters there were. And I think those undecided voters, maybe you would see more move towards libertarian or a third-party candidate as they actually go to the ballot box. But because that number was so small, then it didn't surprise me that libertarians didn't get more votes, because we already saw that people were divided into their camps like way at the beginning of the race.
Which is very unusual, because that number, I think the anticipation, and tell me your take on it, the anticipation was that Brian Kemp would slowly but surely expand to a, if not overwhelming, a comfortable lead in the polls, the way Nathan Deal had done in 2010 and especially in 2014 against Jason Carter. Was that what your Republicans and the Kemp campaign had been telling you was going to happen, or that they had anticipated that and it just didn't materialize?
That was the conventional wisdom, and had been the conventional wisdom in previous races. But I don't... Once Kemp won the nomination, he came out with these sort of more like moderate ads.
Right.
And he was trying to sell himself more as like a moderate candidate, family man, that kind of thing.
Sure.
But that never was really the sense that I got from the campaign, that they were really pushing that very strongly. Kemp was always a candidate who was devoted to his base, and his as a character, he's always a fighter for his base, and I didn't really see that change much during the general. He toned it down a little bit, but not that much. So I think that the Kemp campaign saw that they needed to ramp up turnout in more rural, white, conservative areas, and that's what they did. And partisanship is the way that it is, and so that they figured that they could win doing that.
Right.
Yeah. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. Well, I mean, just wrapping up, what are some of the stories that we should expect coming from you in the next, going ahead, looking, through the holidays?
Through the holidays?
Yeah.
Hopefully I have some stories before the holidays. Continue to look at voting issues that happened in 2018 and the debate over voting machines that's coming up in the state legislature. A lawyer for the Secretary of State's office said recently that if the state doesn't switch to a paper-based system by 2020, the federal courts will order it to do so. Mm. So that is going to be continuing to play out over the next number of months. I really think that voting will remain a central issue in Georgia and in the country ahead of 2020. And I think Georgia will be the epicenter of that potentially again. We don't know exactly what that'll look like, but yeah.
Well, it definitely seems like you've guaranteed yourself some work, at least through the next couple of years. Well, Johnny, on behalf of the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia, thank you very much for taking some time this morning to talk politics with us, and look forward to sitting down again, maybe in the near future.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, sir.